Excellent. Well, first off, let me just say how excited I am to be back with you all. I was super excited preparing for this, to be with you all, to worship with you. And I look forward to the day when we'll be able to worship together once more in person. So let me first start off by asking this question. Oh, how the tables have turned. Now, is this just a passing phrase used by contemporary society to rejoice in the victory of the underdog? Or is it a theologically rich truth that becomes a pattern for how God works in human history to glorify and bring to pass his redemptive plan? Now listen, we've all been in situations where the tables have turned either for our favor or against us, or perhaps we've seen such situations. We're able to understand the impact of that. So, I mean, I'm Romanian. Romanian culture is soccer, right? So there's just something totally insane whenever a sports team goes throughout the season undefeated and then loses in the finals in the championship game to a team that they beat in the season 5-0. There's just something absolutely insane when the tables get turned around them like that. But on the other hand, there's perhaps nothing as gratifying as having the tables turned for your favor. So a few days ago, I was playing a board game with a group of friends of mine, and the first game, I was literally last. Everybody was advancing throughout the game, and for turns and turns and turns, I didn't even move up one space. Like, I had to hide my tears to, not show how wounded my pride was. It was difficult. But the second time around, you know who finished first? This guy. And now everybody who was mocking me the first time around, second time through, they realized that I was the victim. In that moment, what more appropriate thing can you say than, oh, how the tables have turned? What could possibly be a more gratifying experience than having the tables turned for your favor? But my question is this a way that God oftentimes works in human history to bring about his redemptive plans or not? The short answer to that is yes. And in fact, we could provide a few examples of this. We can even just think about Jacob, for example, in the Old Testament. How is it that Jacob, firstborn's blessing? Well, he went to his father, who was basically blind, he couldn't see, and in his lack of sight, he pretended to be a sibling, dressed as his brother, and received the blessing. Now keep that in mind and think about Jacob. How is it that he first ended up with 2 wives? Well, on the night of his marriage, his father-in-law came to Jacob in the darkness of night where Jacob couldn't see and passed off one sibling who pretended to be another. How the tables had turned against Jacob, the deceiver was deceived. Or even perhaps we can look at David's life. David, for a good portion of his life, was running away from King Saul, who was pursuing one of his own servants and trying to kill him, a servant who only ever advanced his kingdom. Now let's hold on to that and think many, many years later, when David is pursuing the life of Uriah and ends up killing him, his servant, who we actually find out has more integrity when he's drunk than David and his sobriety. How the tables had turned against David, the victim had become the perpetrator. And so actually, as we go throughout the Bible, we see that God is turning tables around over and over and over again, not simply in a manner in which was exalted is brought low, but oftentimes when the one who is low, the one who is humble, is exalted and brought high. And this is exactly what we see in our passage this morning. And in particular, this is what I wanted us to meditate on. I want us to meditate this morning on Hannah's song, and in particular, God, our God who turns tables around. Now, within theological jargon, this is called a reversal. It is a reversal in which God brings low those who are exalted and arrogant, and brings high those who are humble and meek and followed the Lord in faithfulness. In chapter 1, we see Hannah, who's just driven to sorrow, driven to despair, and especially just driven to despair by her rival, But we understand that God worked in Hannah's life. And chapter 2, we see Hannah after she had Samuel and after she had dedicated Samuel to the Lord's service just as she had promised. And so what I want us to see this morning is to see that our God is a God of reversals. Our God is a God who comes around. Now, I don't think I have to ask by a show of hands how many of you are looking for at least one reversal in your life. I think a lot of us are struggling in certain areas of our lives, and we're waiting for God to come in and to turn tables around. We're in relationships where we need God to come in and to repair. We're working jobs that are just simply draining us and at certain times seem to be meaningless to us. Perhaps some of our spiritual lives are dry and barren, and we need God to come in and give us a renewed spirit. What we discover in our text this morning is that we have a God who turns tables. We have what we'll see in the text this morning. Number one, a God who can turn tables around. Number two, a God who does turn tables around. And number three, a God who will turn tables around. Number one, a God who can turn tables around. What we first see in Hannah's song is a meditation on the character of God as God who does bring about reversals. Notice too how Hannah moves from her distress in chapter 1 to chapter 2 where she's just exultant. How many of you would want that for yourselves in your lives? The reason this switch happens is because Hannah knows her God. She serves a big God, and she knows that she serves a big God. In the first chapter of his timeless book, Knowledge of the Holy, he writes this: the gravest question before the church is always God himself. And the most potential about any man is not what he at any given time would do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like. Were we able to extract from any man a complete to the question, what comes into your mind when you think about God, we might predict with certainty the future of that man. Did you catch that? He is basically saying the quality of your spiritual life is determined by your view of God. Listen, if you serve a small God, you're going to have a rough time. But if you serve a big God, even in the difficult seasons of life, nevertheless, your heart has what it takes. It has the sustenance in God to rejoice evermore, to rejoice again. And so the first question for us is, could it be that you're so easily driven to despair and so often ensnared in sin and so scarcely amazed by God because you worship a small God whose light can't shine through the darkness of your life, whose power can't break you free from sin, and whose grandeur can't amaze you? So let's zoom in a little bit though. What exactly is it that Hannah realizes about God's character that causes her strength to be renewed, that causes her heart to exalt in God? She realizes that, among other things, God is incomparable. Nobody can compare to God. And we see this in three areas in particular. First, no one is holy like our God. Now, holiness in the Bible offers two senses. Number one, holiness, that someone or something is set apart. And so we understand that God creates the world. We understand that God is near to his created order, that he is in intimate relationships with his children. But nevertheless, God is distinct from his creation. And so we might say that God is holy, holy, holy to the superlative degree. The creator is distinct from his creation. He is holy. But holiness in the Bible also has to do with moral perfection. You realize that at any given time, no one has ever been able to call God a mistake. No one has ever been able to justly accuse God of making the wrong decision, of making a moral blunder. Why is that? Because God is holy, and in fact, no one is holy like God. Why is it that we can come before God with all of our life's problems and distresses? We can go to God with our problems and entrust ourselves to him because we're not relying on an evil force who delights in causing us pain, but we're bringing our requests before a good and holy God who delights in justice and righteousness. No one is holy like our God. No one compares to our God in holiness. Well, the second thing we see in our text is that God is incomparable in, as verse 2 says, being a rock. But just what does this mean? Does this mean that if God gets in a fist fight with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, that God's going to win? Well, we're actually not far off. The question, what does this imagery of rock imply or insinuate? In the Bible, this image of rock implies strength or protection. In other words, no one can provide strength to you like God can, and no one can provide protection for you like God can. Now, we in our lives have our sources of strength and protection. But the question is, what is your ultimate source of strength and protection? Maybe we rely on our friends and family for strength, which certainly has its place, but nothing compares to God, not even our family, not even our closest friends, as a source of strength and protection. Maybe we rely on our intellects and our own ingenuity to get us out of situations, to protect us. Maybe we have this intense sense of self-sufficiency due to our intellects. Listen, no one compares to our God in being a rock. No one is a source of strength and protection like our God. But finally, Hannah says this in verse 3, talk no more so very proudly, let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. Nobody is knowledgeable like our God. We understand that God is omniscient. We understand that God knows all things. But what's the emphasis here? Is this verse simply saying that God is the greatest encyclopedia that there is? No, I think it goes beyond that. It's saying something more simply than God has all the information available. But the question is, he has all the information available toward what end? What does this final line say? And by actions are weighed. In other words, God has all of the information available and necessary to make the just and right decision every single time. Now, I'm curious here. How many of you are familiar with the name Francisco Boix? Actually, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. It's spelled B-O-I-X. It's pronounced either Boy or Boix, but Francisco Boix. So he was a Spaniard who was taken to a German concentration camp in 1940 as a political enemy. But from 1941 to 1945, in the concentration camp, he worked developing film for one of the leading SS generals. His name was Paul Ricken. He basically worked in the Department of Propaganda. He was documenting what took place in the concentration camp, documenting the people who were there and the generals who were coming, so on and so forth. So this individual, Francisco Boix, throughout his time, he's working with this SS general. He's developing film, but what he did throughout these years is that he stole and hid some of the negatives, because he knew that when he was out of the concentration camp, in order for justice to be served correctly, people needed to know just what is it that happened in the concentration camps and who was involved in bringing evils. He needed hard evidence in order to accumulate all this information to pass justice against these war criminals. And so during the Nuremberg trials, he was called to testify against the SS and showed conditions of the concentration camps and all the generals that came in. And he was used in the Nuremberg trials to pass judgment against them because he was able to provide the necessary information. He had those negatives. He had the proof. He had the evidence. Now, maybe some of us are in life situations where we feel like, man, I'm going to a higher authority and they're just not righting this wrong because they don't have all the information. I wish they knew all the evils that were being done against me. I wish they had all the information about the evils done against my friends, against my family, against this particular people group. Do you understand that with God, he has all the negatives? He has all the pictures. He has all of the evidence. He has all of the proof. Why is it that our strength can be renewed and our hearts be exalted? Because no one has knowledge like our God. No one has all of the information like our God. Our God has all of the information, all of the knowledge necessary to bring about perfect justice. The first thing that we learn about our God is that he is a God who can. He is a God who can turn tables around. He is a God who can bring revival about. He is a God who can, because of his character. Nobody compares to him in holiness. Nobody compares to him in being a source of strength and protection. Nobody compares to him in knowledge, in having all the information necessary to bring about the right judgments. The second thing we learn in this text is that we serve a God who does turn tables. He's a God who can turn tables around. We second see that he's a God who does turn. Verses 4 and 5 make this point very explicit. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble binds on strength. Those who are full have themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased. The barren has borne 7, but he who has many children is forlorn. So the idea is very simple. The unjust who are arrogant are brought low, and those who are just, who are lowly, are exalted and brought high. Verses 4 through 5 make this very explicit. But what really stands out here are verses 6 through 8, namely God's involvement in all this. So verses 6 through 8. The Lord, Yahweh, he kills and brings to life. He brings to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. Now, when we read this and are given this image of a God who is so involved, our modern minds might see a certain comparison. We might say, on the one hand, we have a God who is very involved, and on the other hand, we have a worldview that tells us that there's no God. What moves human history forward is simply randomness. It's simply chance. It's simply whatever the result of all these micro-level chemical combustions. In fact, I think it was Richard Dawkins who said we're basically just dancing to the molecules, to the tune of our chemicals, right? So in our modern minds, we might think, okay, there's a God who's very involved versus a world that's driven by impersonal random forces. But the interesting thing is that comparison would never have been made in the ancient world. The ancient world doesn't have these atheistic leanings like our contemporary and our modern world does. For them, it was never God versus random forces and chance, but it was rather God versus gods. In their world, in their alternate worldviews, there was a pantheon of gods, and each god was powerful or had authority over a different domain of life. And so if you were going off to war, you would sacrifice to the war god. If you wanted sustenance, if you wanted abundance in, agriculture in your fields, in your land, you would sacrifice to Baal, the rain god, for example. If you wanted a lot of children, you would sacrifice to the fertility goddess, to Asherah, for example. But what we see in the Bible over and over and over again is the God of Israel continuously reinforces the fact over and over and over again that I am just one and I am sovereign over all of the domains of life. So what we see here is that the one God of Israel, he's sovereign over war. He's sovereign over sustenance. He's sovereign over agriculture. He's sovereign over the family unit. The emphasis here is that Yahweh, he's the one who does all this. So here's the thing though. We moderns are a bit more sophisticated than to buy into this polytheistic worldview where one God is sovereign over this and one God is sovereign over this, right? I mean, we're a bit more sophisticated than that. That's so primitive. We've moved on from that. And yet, we can be just as guilty as the polytheists who doubt God's sovereignty over every domain of life when we choose our God as the object of our, we fit him in our religious category, but we don't think that God is sufficient for all the other categories of life. Rather, we're the God of the other categories of our life. And yet, God won't have any. God is not simply your God on Sundays. He is the God of every second of your life, of every minute of your life, of every hour, of every day, of every week, of the completeness of your life, of the totality of your life. A theologian I've recently read wrote this: following Christ as King means under every aspect of your life to him. Work, relationships, family, your past, your future, everything. Colossians 1:15-20 proclaims Christ as the creator, sustainer, and reconciler of all things. Everything that exists was made through him and for him. Trees, people, enchiladas, the solar system, marriage, guitars, everything exists for Jesus and his glory. Jesus will not settle for being your spiritual butler. He is King of creation. Jesus does not fit into your religious compartment. He is King of creation. Jesus is not merely the leader of a religion. He is King of creation. And so maybe you find yourself in a situation of life where you desperately need God to turn around, where you desperately need a reversal in your life. And you're wondering, well, what's the problem here? Why hasn't God brought about the reversal in my life? Well, maybe the problem is this. Maybe the problem is that God exalts the humble and down those who are arrogant. God exalts those who worship God in every domain of life. And maybe your problem is that you don't worship God as the God of every domain of your life. Maybe you fit God nicely into your religious compartment, but you don't understand that it's God who gives life and takes away. It's God who gives children. It's God who is so on and so forth. And so maybe you're a student and you're hoping, hey, look, I want to go to a good college. I want to get a lot of these good recommendation letters. I want to do all of these things. But you're utterly without integrity and you're cheating throughout all of your classes because you want to manipulate a good grade in order to get far. If this is you, don't expect God to bring a reversal out in your life. God exalts the humble and the faithful and brings down those who are arrogant. Rather, humble yourself before the mighty hand of the Lord. He will exalt you in the proper time. Rather, acknowledge the Lordship of God, the Lordship of Jesus in this area of your life, and see if he'll bring out a reversal then. Maybe you're a business owner and you're struggling and you're wondering why things are so difficult for you financially, things are so difficult for you within your business. Maybe you're failing to embody humility and lead with integrity. If you're running a business and you're overcharging your clients and underpaying your laborers and employees, don't expect God to bring a reversal in your life. Don't expect God to turn tables around. In fact, you are the arrogant who God is going to bring down rather than to exalt. Maybe you've got a few relationships in your life that you really need God to step in and to repair. And you've been wondering why God hasn't done anything. You've been praying and no reversal in your life. Well, do you acknowledge the Lordship of God in every area of your life? Are you humble and him there? Maybe your problem is that you need control. You lose it if you're not in control of everything. And so you try to control everybody. You try to control all of your relationships, and you lead everything with a heavy hand. As long as you do this, God is not going to bring a reversal in your life. You need to humble yourself. Maybe your problem is on the other end of the spectrum and you idolize safety to the degree that you're just a pushover and you don't confront whenever you ought to confront to correct an evil. Once more, don't expect God to reversal in this area of your life if you're not acknowledging the sovereignty of God in this area of your life. We know that we serve a big God. We know that he can turn around. We know that he's the one who turns things around. And so maybe the reason he hasn't turned things around in your life is you're not in the category of the humble, faithful person who God exalts, but you're actually in the category of the wicked person whom God is going to bring low. So moving from a God who does bring about reversals, we finish with the last verses in this passage with the God who will bring about. We've seen the God who can, we've seen the God who does, but we also see finally the God who will. We know that God is a God who does, but we also from our own experience know that he's a God who does, but he doesn't always. I mean, has anyone had all of their prayer requests answered? And I'm sure we can all put our finger on certain prayer requests that we haven't had answered. Now, you see, this is a difference between a biblical faith and a health, wealth, prosperity faith, which is basically acknowledging the fact that, yes, we serve a God who can, a God who does, but in his divine wisdom, he doesn't always. There is yet a category in Scripture for the saints to cry out until the Lord comes back, "Oh Lord, how long?" And to understand the fact that he is a God who does but doesn't always, by no means puts a limitation on his character or on his being. I mean, what did we just walk through in this text? We've seen that he's a God who can. We've seen that no one compares to God. We've seen that he's a God who does. But rather speaks to the fact that we're fallen human beings living in a fallen world in which we still experience the consequences of sin and death. We're reaping the consequences of what humanity decided to sow in the garden. So this is not by any means a limitation on the character of God. But here is where judgment comes in this passage, because we know that there's an expiration date to the saints crying, "How long, O Lord?" I mean, what do these final verses say here? Verses 9. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. May he give strength to his king. May he exalt the horn of his anointed. We're now talking about the kingdom of God's anointed. We're not talking about the return of Jesus, where he will judge his enemies, where he'll give rest to his faithful and reign over all of the earth. When Jesus returns, no longer will we say that our God is a God who does, but not all. We will only say our God is a God who does, and our God is a God who has. For those of you suffering out to God that he will bring about in your life, but don't experience it, realize that there is an expiration date to your tears and your heartache, and you're crying out to God, "How long, O Lord?" Persecution against God's people will definitively end. Unpunished evils by individuals and governments will come to an end. The brokenness of this world and the reality of sin and death will have an end. Human history is moving toward a meaningful end, and redemption and reversal will be realized. This is the hope. This is what anchors us in the present sufferings and motivates us to move forward with encouragement, with joy. But maybe there's some of you out there who have simply been through too much to receive this good news right now. You say, "Look, I hear what you're saying, and I've heard this for many years, but as far as I'm concerned, this simply isn't good news to me anymore. I've just been through too much for me to simply believe this anymore." One of my favorite verses in all the Bible is Exodus 6:9. In Exodus 6:1-8, God tells Moses to go to the children of Israel who are in Egypt, and he tells Moses to tell them that God will rescue them from Pharaoh's mighty hand and lead them into the land that God promised Abraham. God just told them that he's going to bring about this incredible, mighty reversal, which we call the Exodus. But what is their reaction? Exodus 6:9. Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit or slavery. The reason I love this is not because I endorse that as a reaction to God's promises, but because this verse shows me that this book understands me as a human being. This book, the God who speaks through this book, understands us as human beings. God understands that sometimes we're simply of broken spirits and our realities are too harsh for us to receive this good news and rejoice in it as we should. And so maybe some of you are just too jaded at this point and you're embodying the reaction of the Israelites here. You hear this message that God is coming back to right all the wrongs and accomplish this final reversal, but feel that after everything that you've been through and seen in the world, just what guarantee is there that God is going to do this? Just what guarantee is there that God still even cares? How do I know that God will bring about this cosmic reversal? I know for a fact that this is a guaranteed truth because he's brought about a cosmic reversal once before. But in this cosmic reversal, it wasn't the righteous that was brought up and the wicked that was brought low. It was the righteous and the faithful that was brought low and crushed by righteous God the Father, so that the wicked could be brought high and justified before God the Father and be made acceptable before him. In this cosmic reversal, we have 2 Corinthians 5:21 to explain what happened. For our sake, he made him who knew no sin to become sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus, God in the flesh, the only perfect righteous man that ever was, humbled himself to the point of death, death even on the cross, so that in his resurrection, as Ephesians says, we might be raised to life with Jesus Christ and seated in the heavenly places with God the Father. We have been adopted into his family and been given this incredible inheritance in this cosmic reversal. Do you doubt God's commitment to you as his child? Do you doubt his faithfulness? Do you doubt his justice? Well, then turn back and at the cross and tell me whether you're still able to doubt the commitment, faith, and justice of God. Do you need God to turn around some tables for you today? Well, first, realize that he is a God who cares. Hannah is moved from weeping to rejoicing because she understands that she serves a big God. Nobody compares to our God in holiness, in strength, protection, and in knowledge which leads toward justice. Realize that our God is a God who does turn tables around, but he brings about reversals for those who are humble, for those who acknowledge God's sovereignty over every domain of life. And finally, as you wrestle with the fact that God hasn't turned around all the tables in your life, and in the fact that he may not in this life bring the reversals that you want to, stay anchored in your future looking hope, in your future hope, as you look forward to the future cosmic reversal that he'll bring, by looking back to the cosmic reversal that he has already brought in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the justification of sinners. The most important question for any Christian, as A.W. Tozer says, is figuring out just who God is. Who is God? What is your conception of God? Hannah is filled with joy because her God is one who can bring about reversals, who does bring about reversals, and who finally will bring about reversals. And so may we this day rejoice like Hannah in our God, for the God that we serve. May God help us all. And I hope that the Holy Spirit takes these truths and prints them on all of our, so that in our weakness, our strength can, and our hearts can be exalted in the being of God the Father.
Thank you, John. What a great reminder of